listen to me talk about Dada. I mean, that's pretty nice that you guys asked me to come and do this, because this is what I do. So I get to contribute something to the proceedings here, so that's really exciting for me. And I promise I will not take an hour. I won't talk that long because I know you guys are tired. I also am not going to give you a history lesson, because I was in New York last week and I'm walking around and thinking, how do I do this in such a way that I'm not giving a history lesson? Because nobody wants a history lesson as a scholar after a long day of work. So how can I present this information in such a way that will be a little bit more entertainment? And so I'm walking around, I'm looking at all the shows. I was at the Whitney and I went to see Jeff Koons, and of course everything I see around me at the Koons show just screams Dada. We've got this interaction of the museum space with these commercial objects, but it's coming straight out of the ready-made. These tremendous tchotchkes on a grand scale that he had produced by craftspeople in Germany and Italy. This marriage of high culture and low culture within the museum space in this lineup of extraordinary objects. Even the newest work, this massive pile of Play-Doh that is actually made up of, I think it's 27 pieces, I think actually make this up. They all fit together to make this huge thing. It's brand new, just recently fabricated. I call it festive meets the fecal, because it's a very disturbing object to look at, because on the one hand it looks soft and you want to play with it, at the same time it looks disturbing. There's Jasper John's flag over there, and here now we've got the interaction of symbol and representation. Is it a flag? Is it a painting of a flag? What's the difference? Is that important? These are issues that come out of Dada as well. Rauschenberg, the glut and density of information in the age of modern media that was just beginning in the 20th century. How do we piece things together? How do we decide what's important and not important? Again, all stuff coming out of Dada. Andy Warhol, the simultaneous celebration and perhaps condemnation of materialism and consumer society, which is true, which is not true. This again also comes out. The Dada's, we're doing all of these things I'm mentioning at the beginning of the century, in the short 7 years that Dada existed between 1916 and 1923. All of these things were being done in an earlier kind of iteration. Of course, in the early 20th century, there were brands in the way that there were in the 1960s, where with Warhol, it's not just soup, it's Campbell soup. There's a difference in the 1960s, whereas brand recognition wasn't quite the same at the beginning of the century. But even stuff, I was walking around MoMA and looking at Carl Andre's piece of vulcanized rubber that he's taken and folded it to create, that's Richard Serra, that's not Carl Andre, this piece of vulcanized rubber that he's folded over and created this form out of a piece of industrial detritus. Or Lawrence Weiner up there with his statement that either can be enacted by an individual, you can either shoot the wall with an air rifle, or you can put the statement up. It's up to you. But this idea that both the act and the verbiage of the act both constitute an artistic statement. Dada's already did it 50 years before this. Oh, and then of course the massively hyper-intensive, absurdly pseudo-intellectual work of Damien Hirst at the Met that, again, is trotting out the same kind of old Dada tricks once again now in the 1990s here, but in a different formulation that speaks of excess and fits very well inside the most excessive of New York institutions, the Metropolitan Museum. And then Banksy, thankfully, painting over a Damien Hirst here in this recognition that it's an artist's job not only to have something to say about one's own time, but also to essentially, knock the piss out of those who need to have it knocked out of them the most. And then finally, at the end of the week, going to see the Ai Weiwei opening at Francis Naumann, where Ai Weiwei probably, in terms of our own time, is most Dadaist of contemporary artists in terms not only of the forms of expression, but also the political nature, which in the United States wasn't a big part of Dada, but was a huge part of European Dada. And here's one of Ai Weiwei's famous part of his middle finger series of giving the finger to various institutions, which is a something, again, that was created by the Dadaists to a certain extent. Oh, here we are. Ai Weiwei essentially has his entire life filmed, and everything he does is filmed, and all of his exhibitions are filmed as well. And so Francis put a camera in the gallery for us all to be filmed, so we all gave him the finger there back in China, so he could appreciate our knowledge of his presence, in a sense, at the exhibition. But what is Dada? How does one, in half an hour, encapsulate something as massive? Because Dada was fast. Dada came and went. It was a movement that burned bright and burned quickly because it kind of had to. Because it was so nihilistic and it was so against virtually everything that how can something that's against everything perpetuate itself? In fact, the most Dada of expressions, or the most Dada thing one can be, is actually anti-Dada. And many Dadaists were anti-Dada and expressed the death of Dada many times in their literature and in their art, because Dada is anti-institution. So how can Dada be a movement if in order to be a movement you have to collect and be a member of something? Marcel Duchamp never really proclaimed himself part of the Dada movement, because after the bad situation that he had with the Golden Section in Paris, when they rejected his new Descending a Staircase on the grounds that it wasn't a proper cubist painting, and they said, you can change the title to something else, but you can't call it New Descending a Staircase, and so he took the painting out of the exhibition, and it ended up in the Armory Show in the United States, and is now one of the sort of most important paintings at the beginning of the century. But to think that it was rejected from a show at the beginning of its existence tells you something about why Duchamp was someone who did not want membership in any organization, because he knew that membership instantly puts you in a position where now you have to agree with someone else. You have to collectively work towards something, and if Dadaists are essentially against all things, then how can you... It's obviously very contradictory, but in a strange way it works. So I was reading part of Theo van Doesburg's poster that he did for the Dada tour that he did in Holland, where he went around, and Kurt Schwitters was with him during part of it, where he would attempt to give lectures about Dada while Schwitters sneezed and barked like a dog the whole time he was trying to give the lecture, and doing other things to subvert the idea that one could explain Dada to someone that apparently I'm trying to do now for some reason. But I liked this idea of trying to explain what Dada is. And so I came up, but I felt like I had to limit myself because one could go on forever. So I limited myself to a single letter. That everything had to begin with one letter. I thought, okay, I'll do I, because I had a couple I's already in my mind. And they already had one here, Dada being idiotic, which is true, and we'll go into that. But, so this idea of Dada is, and we can kind of go through some different aspects of it that I think will characterize it well for us, for our purposes. Start with this idea that Dada is irrational. Dada as a movement really comes out of World War I. That's like sort of the main thing, I think, that is the impetus for Dada as a movement, because basically, if we think about Enlightenment Europe starting in the 18th century and coming to a head at the beginning of the 20th century in France and Germany, well, if World War I, which was, to them, not World War I, but the Great War, this massive, bloody battle that took place over continents and many millions of people died. If this was the result, if this was sort of the, I guess you could say, sort of the end result of the Enlightenment, then apparently reason wasn't what humanity was looking for, because it didn't seem to work very well. So in the minds of artists like this, not only did reason not result in a kind of society, but why would one then also create a type of art that uses reason as its foundation if what it results in is something like World War I? So right off the bat, the idea comes that irrationality and subverting reason is what the art of the day should be. It's art that would reflect what the world is that one lives in, when one can be in a building and a bomb can drop on the building next to you and all the people in that building died, but you don't get bombed and you survive. Why did you survive and they died? Some kind of chance, some kind of, again, these are nihilistic people. These aren't people who are thinking about that there's a larger plan and that it was their time to die and it wasn't my time to die. These people don't believe in a sort of end result of things or a larger meaning to the universe. So in their mind, it's entirely chance that those people are dead and that you're alive. That is, to them, a completely irrational thing, and so art should reflect this lack of rationality. So Tristan Tzara is one of the early leaders of the Dada movement. Dada starts in Zurich. It starts in a number of different cities, and we'll go through that, but Zurich's really the very beginnings of it, through performances at Cabaret Voltaire. And the way Dada's name comes about explains Dada in a lot of ways. Tzara and a number of individuals were, again, this is all legend. This is not fact. I'm not, telling you history. I'm telling you what the most popular version of the story is of how the name Dada comes about. But Tzara takes a paper knife, he sticks it into a book, and whatever word that knife points to will be the name of this movement, and it just happened to point to the word Dada, which in French is, it's the French word for hobby horse. For those familiar with what that is, it's like a stick with a horse's head at the end, and kids run around. I didn't think they still had them, and I'm in the store the other day, and there's a hobby horse, and so I got one for me, and she's obviously got to have them. But Dada means a lot of things. It doesn't just mean hobby horse. If we take it into the various languages, in English, daddy. In Russian, it means yes, yes. But in Romanian, where Tristan Tzara actually is from, he's Romanian. In Romania, it would mean yes, yes, but not yes, yes, like yes, yes. It would mean more like yeah, right. Which is not saying yes, it is saying yes, but it's not really saying yes. It's actually saying, I don't believe you. So you're really saying no, even though you're saying yes. So in fact, the very name of the movement is an ironic phrase for something. And irony is also a big part of Dada, because typically when the Dadaists are saying something, that's not really what they're saying. They're actually saying something else. And if you read this part of Tzara's lecture on Dada, you get a sense of not only the irony involved in what these artists are all about, but also their complete disbelief in reason, and that reason is a way of conducting oneself. So Dada is ironic, and so you can't take any Dada gesture at face value. You have to try to figure out what it is the artist is trying to accomplish through this gesture or through this art. For example, I think of Arp's collage arranged according to the laws of chance. So Arp's doing a collage. He's Schwitters. He's one of the artists involved with Zurich Dada. And he's trying to come up with a collage. He gets very frustrated, so he rips these pieces of colored paper up into little squares, and he drops them down on the paper, and he glues them down where they landed. He says, that is my composition. I've found the means by which to create a composition. I will use gravity as the means by which to combine my composition. So it's entirely the laws of chance that have created this. Well, that's true and not true. One, no one really believes that these landed in this place by chance. No one believes it. I don't think anyone at the time believed, and I don't think anyone today believes that a composition this well balanced and this unified is one that's completely a result of chance. Take 15 or so little piece of paper and drop them on a table, and you'll see what I mean. You get a mess that in no way has this kind of balance. So clearly there was some kind of intervention on the part of the artist, but also it's not that chance created this artwork, it's that art created a procedure. He created a process by which an artwork could be created. Yes, gravity played a big role in it, but without Arp's creation of the scenario, the circumstances, then the art wouldn't have been able to be produced. So he's being kind of ironic here. It's not really chance that created this artwork. Again, it's more a process that he divined himself. Dada is international, and that's a really important part of the movement as well, because each different faction of Dada had a different purpose for being Dada. It spreads out from Zurich into cities like Berlin and Paris. We can look at a map, you can see where all the major Dada locations were. Zurich's where things basically start. The German Dada had a much more political kind of focus than other forms of Dada, and it makes a lot of sense because they're much closer to the action. They're much more involved in the war than, say, New York, where there's very, very little political component to that Dada. That Dada had a very different kind of program to it. Some of these movements were larger. Berlin Dada had many members. Hanover Dada is essentially Kurt Schwitters, all by himself, making collages. But he was a major, major member of the movement. So the fact that he was doing his Ernst stuff was a crucial part of the movement, and he was a crucial connector to places like Holland, which didn't have an official Dada movement, even though Theo van Doesburg did those lectures, but there wasn't really a Dada core there necessarily. Hugo Ball here performing Caravan or Caravana. which is a good example of how Dadists were seeking to not only take advantage of nonsense, take advantage of chance, take advantage of these random things, but also to liberate things like language. And what does one mean when it says liberate language? Well, to these artists, one of the big problems for language is that we had subjected a kind of meaning to it, where we had said this particular sound or this particular word means something, and those two things are inextricably attached and cannot be separated. Well, these artists wanted to undermine virtually every kind of convention in existence. And so to them, one of the main things that needed to be liberated was language. It needed to be liberated from the sense that a particular sound has to mean something, an arrangement of words has to mean something. So Hugo Ball here is performing this piece he did. He couldn't walk in this costume, so he had to be lifted up and set onto the stage at the Cabaret Voltaire. And he's basically wearing a Cubist version of a priest's robes, or like a bishop's robe. He called it his magic bishop outfit. And so he would get up on stage, and he would intone these essentially nonsense poems. And I've got him, this is not him reading it, there is no recording of Ball reading this poem, unfortunately. But I have a sound file here, and let's see if it plays. If it doesn't play, it's not the end of the world, but maybe it'll play for us. You can hear him, it's short. So, you probably hear a familiar sound. Some of it might sound, first of all, it's got, the way that it's intoned right off the bat has a kind of sacred sort of quality to it, almost like he's intoning some kind of liturgical phrase or something like that. But it's all complete and utter nonsense. Some of the sounds might be familiar as sounding African or Asian or something like that. And he is using those non-Western influences as inspiration for the kinds of sounds that he's using. But what he's trying to basically say is that sound, he calls it sound poem. And it's not something that one can interpret according to phrases or language that we might know. It's something that you have to now completely forget everything you know about how to approach a poem or how to process information from a poem and start completely from scratch and start over and say, okay, now how do I derive meaning from this, if there is any? How do I derive feeling from this, if there is any? This reclamation and elevation of detritus and the low and the vulgar, big part of Dada. Kurt Schwitters, in his take on World War I, was a certain excitement that now that he had nothing, he had everything to work with, because basically the war had deprived him of everything. He had no money, he had no resources. So his resources were whatever was around him, because that was all he had access to. And he found, I think, a certain level of excitement in that World War I had kind of leveled the playing field. And so he would go out and he would pick up bits of trash and different kinds of two-dimensional items, and he would put them together in these collages that he called Merz Bilder. Merz is a made-up word, but it's the second half of the word commerce, or commerce, that he once saw in a collage that he did. And he liked this idea that it kind of derives from the remains and detritus of the sort of economy, the commercial world, yet at the same time, you don't pay for it, it's free. This material is all out there. And artists involved in the Dada movement used a lot of found objects in their work, and things that are part of the commercial enterprise or the larger commercial complex, but at the same time can be acquired in a variety of ways. Raoul Houseman's a Berlin Dada artist, and a big part of Berlin Dada was issues regarding identity within the larger social complex, and how people were beginning to feel like they were losing their identity. Films like Metropolis later on in the 1920s will explore this as well, but you can see this is prior to that. And here Houseman, with his mechanical head, he's created this sort of automaton-ish looking figure whose head has stuck to it all of these different items that we associate with measurement. They're things that are measurable and definable which is sort of the, if that's the spirit of the age, then the fact that it's limited is sad, that it doesn't go beyond something as measurable as that cup on his head or that ruler. The wallet, the crocodile wallet stuck to the side of his head, speaking of his financial situation as a big part of his identity as well. Max Ernst was a part of Cologne Dada, later to become part of Paris Dada, and then a member of the Surrealist movement. And even his Dada stuff already has kind of the beginnings of Surrealism in it, especially these early collages. He'll really hit his stride with the later collages when he takes all the Victorian material and puts it together, but these early ones already have kind of an element of fantasy to it. It's a little different than what you see in a lot of Dada. But again, using this found kind of material, this material that's all part of the media, and now putting it together in new and different ways in order to say things. But his is so poetic, it's very different from what you see in a lot of Dada. And then, again, more Berlin Dada artists like Hannah Hawk, who's dealing with the issue of the new woman in early 20th century society, plus the industrial complex around her. There's a lot of political figures in this and a lot of artistic figures. This is, you could teach a course just on this one collage. It's very dense and very rich in terms of the material. But like I said, these artists tended to be significantly more critical of the political circumstances around them. Here, George Gross, who starts as a Dada artist and he'll later become part of a movement called the New Objectivity when he starts painting representational scenes again. But here it's a very, very famous drawing where this doctor is declaring this skeleton KV, which is the initials for the, or an acronym for the German word for fit for active service. So basically saying this guy's ready to go back out and fight again, as all of the upper level administration of the material all laugh and have a good time and smoke a cigar. And again, this idea of identity, and that there's this sort of loss of identity in modern society, a lot of machine aesthetic, as they call it, that you're going to see throughout as artists are beginning to embrace the machine as the symbol of the modern age, yet at the same time, that automaton kind of quality can also be seen negatively as it impacts upon identity. Here we're looking at two veterans of World War I, who are out still with that nationalistic sense and still celebrating. Guys waving the German flag. That guy's going 1, 2, 3, hooray! But he doesn't have hands. You can see he's missing a leg. So these guys have lost a lot in the war, yet at the same time they still have that strong sense of national identity that Gross and a lot of others believe is at the expense of personal identity in the sense of self. Okay, so Dada's iconoclastic. Dada seeks to take institutions, take any kind of accepted, cherished belief, and mock it, parody it, attempt to destroy it in some way or another, because they believe that that is what it is that art's job is to do, is to take these cherished, accepted beliefs and to make you rethink them. Why is this something that everybody just accepts as the norm or accepts as the way things are supposed to be? In terms of iconoclasm, many of the Dadaist artists were anti-clerical. They were not particularly interested in following religion. Not only were they not interested in following religion, but they sought to parody it as well. Here, Francis Macabia with his Holy Virgin. This ink stain was published in 391, a magazine that he ends up publishing in the late teens. And this image is, there's been a lot written about it because there's a lot being said in terms of how this can be understood as iconoclastic or speaking negatively about the Christian religion, whether you're talking about the idea of the Holy Virgin, and here this stain having reference to it's like the virgin birth, not the Immaculate Conception, that's Anne. The virgin birth, and also then this idea of chance, this sort of random ink splot that's being now compared to one of the most, accepted and one of the most beloved figures in the religious world. Taking a plumbing trap and nailing it onto a miter box and calling it God is not something that a lot of people would find to be, a popular statement. But again, it's trying clearly to undermine, trying clearly to subvert, and trying to get under people's skin. The sort of quintessential moment of Dada in New York, and the one that God most likely comes out of, is Marcel Duchamp's work called Found, if Duchamp actually made it, or actually is responsible for it. It's an incredibly long and involved story, and I won't go into the entire thing, but just to give you a sense of why this is considered the quintessential Dada gesture. So Marcel Duchamp was part of a group called the Society of Independent Artists, and the fact that he's even on the board of this makes no sense because he shuns all organizations like this, but someone clearly talked him into being on the board. He was very popular at this point because New Descending a Staircase was hugely popular at the Armory Show for being something that people did not like, so that made him very popular with these artists. And so he's on the board, and the Society of Independent Artists is putting together an exhibition that's based on the French Independent, that's an alternative to the Academy or the Salon exhibition, where there's no jury and no prizes. So what it means is you send in $6 and you can have 2 artworks in the show. And no one can say whether or not your work should be in the show or not. There's 2,500 works of art in the first independent show because it's very popular, because you send your money, you get to be in this big exhibition. So Duchamp and a couple friends, Joe Stella and Walter Harrensberg, are having a conversation, and they come up with this idea of buying something and sending it in as kind of as a goof. And so they go to a local plumbing store, J.L. Ironworks, where you can get these types of fixtures, and they buy this urinal, and through a female friend of Duchamp's, she sends it in with the pseudonym Richard Mutt. That's the name of the artist, ostensibly, who was sending this in. And so this arrives on April 7th, the opening is April 10th, this arrives on April 7th, and they open it up, and they're like, shit, what are we going to do? Because we can't put this out there, because, I mean, today this is probably kind of charming that they would consider this so controversial, but they couldn't even say the word urinal in the newspaper at that point. A lot of papers wouldn't even cover it. They could only call it a bathroom fixture. It was too edgy and too grotesque and obscene to even say the word urinal in the newspaper, so even the ones that talked about it had to really kind of dance around the issue. But this was considered at the time to be, a very, very, this is not something that should be, presented as an artwork. So there was a tremendous argument between members of the board. It was split about halfway through. There's all different kinds of versions of the story where the artist William Blacken smashed it, which clearly is not the case because it exists in photographs later on. And what ends up happening seems to be the case is that it was put behind a wall. So it was in the show, but not in the show, because they couldn't reject anything from the show, but it also didn't, there's nothing in the bylaws that said it has to be visible, so it was behind a wall. Duchamp ends up resigning from the board, as do many other people, because the board went back on its promise of no jury, no prizes, and then they published in a journal that Duchamp and several of his friends put together called The Blind Man, this very, very famous essay called The Richard Mutt Case, which used to be, people used to say it was written by Duchamp, but it's most likely written by Beatrice Wood. And in this is arguably the most important written document in 20th century art, because it defines what the ready-made is, or the idea of taking a found object, changing its context, and in doing so, making something into a work of art, which we completely take for granted now, by the way. We go to museums and galleries all the time, and we see stuff that 100 years ago nobody would have considered to be art, and we just immediately embrace it. Well, it all goes back to here. It's actually this phrase here, whether Mr. Mutt with his own hands made the found or not has no importance. He chose it, he took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view, created a new thought for that object. This is essentially the first definition of the ready-made and the idea of the found object. So, there it is. You're welcome, Mr. Rauschenberg, Mr. Coons, all. Oh yeah, it clearly wasn't destroyed because here it is hanging in his doorway in a photograph sometime between 1917 and 1918. So the story of it being smashed and destroyed was one clearly that was either something that was meant to entertain or something that was meant to give people a sense that someone had taken a stand against this horrible action. There had to be a pseudonym, because if it had been by Duchamp, if Duchamp had sent it in, there's no question it would have been in the exhibition, because everyone would have been like, that Duchamp has done it again, he's a genius. But since it was by someone no one knew, they were able to be offended and appalled. These artists replaced the cherished institutions of religion and other subjects that had dominated the art world for centuries with technology, with the new. That's what they believed characterized the century more than anything else. And in New York, that was the place to be, because you've got the beginnings of the skyscraper. In fact, Marcel Duchamp made the Woolworth Building a ready-made. He signed it, and it is one of his ready-mades. I don't know what the signature is. I don't think anyone does, and if you look through the entire building for it, you're insane. Unless you get a grant to do it, maybe. But it is already made in the sense of Duchamp selecting it and making it into art. But it wasn't just the skyscraper. Here, Man Ray is creating artwork that's sort of based on the sort of skyscraper form here by taking a C-clamp and putting... These are actually chromed pieces of wood that are meant to recall sort of the basic shape of a skyscraper. But the automobile, the airplane, these were the things that the Dadaists believed were captured the spirit of the age more than anything else. There's Francis Picabia behind the wheel of one of his many automobiles that he liked to drive probably way too fast. And this machine aesthetic is something that becomes characteristic of much of Dada art. You already saw in many of those collages pieces of industrial material. Francis Picabia did a series of portraits of people where he represented them as machines rather than as their likeness, because they felt that this was a more accurate way of portraying someone. So here Alfred Stieglitz, the famous photographer and gallerist, becomes this sort of combination of an automobile and a camera. Stieglitz had a gallery called 291 because it was at 291 Fifth Avenue. Portrait of a Young American Girl in a State of Nudity is like the sort of classic Picabia machine age or machine aesthetic kind of artwork, because here he's completely eschewed traditional representation in every way, and now he's using something that expresses the idea of something rather than expressing it directly. And it's actually copied directly from an advertisement for Forever spark plugs. And it's hard to know how a spark plug represents a young girl in a state of nudity unless one thinks about what the function of a spark plug is in an engine, and then maybe it becomes a little clearer. It's the thing, it's the catalyst, it's the thing that gets things moving, so to speak. Here is the woman, here's woman. Again, this taking the biological, the organic, and making it into a machine. But in Picabia's work, there's a strong erotic element to it. There's lots of pistons and things that thrust and things that fit into other things. And it's just, these aren't real machines. They're not even, in some cases, based on any real machine. But he's expressing this, this kind of sexual frustration through the machine. Because a lot of times the things that are supposed to do things don't do things. Duchamp did the same thing. If you're familiar with the large glass, you've got the female side separated from the male side. They're supposed to come together, but they never do. There's never any consummation. Duchamp himself said, he was talking to Leger at the salon, the aeronautical salon in Paris, and they're walking around looking at all of the airplanes and all the propellers and stuff, and Duchamp says to Leger, is there anything more beautiful than that propeller? Do you know anyone that can make anything more beautiful than that? It was these clean lines. I mean, when you think about the urinal, I mean, the reason why Duchamp picked a urinal is clearly because he needed something where one could not separate the object from its function. One could not separate the form from what it does, because formally there's nothing really all that offensive about it. In fact, it's a piece of ceramic. Ceramic has been art for thousands and thousands of years. And in fact, some artists had to design that urinal, by the way. How many different choices there are toilets when you go to the store? When you go to Home Depot, why? Do you care what your toilet looks like? Well, apparently, because there's lots of different choices. And the same with these urinals. Someone has to design these things. And so Duchamp saw these as being the objects that were the most beautiful of the age, more so than, say, like an oil painting or something that, to Duchamp, no longer reflected contemporary world. Let's get through. Dada's idiosyncratic. Dadaists tended to be individual. They tend, like I said, that's the sort of irony of Dadaism being a movement, is that each member within the movement tended to be very individual and kind of blaze their own trail. The Baroness is probably the most famous figure for being the most outlandish of New York Dadaists. As Man Ray said, she wasn't a Dadaist, she was Dada. She was the living embodiment of Dada in her clothes, in her lifestyle. She was actually a Baroness. Her name was the Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Moringhoven, and she was married to a baron who died before She arrived in New York. She lived in a state of absolute abject poverty. She stole most of what she wore and what she ate and what she made art out of. But she also just had this completely irrepressible spirit. She wrote poems that similarly used words not just for their denotative meaning, but for how the sound could express meaning as well. She was utterly crude and vulgar and everything that a good Dadaist in New York at that time would want to be. She wore, again, she just took garbage and made clothing out of it. She wore bird cages on her head. She shaved her head and painted the top of her head different colors. All of this, and then, walked around the streets of Greenwich Village, and everyone knew who she was. How could you not know who she was? And she was kind of a minor celebrity. She made some money as an artist model as well. Most of her poetry was published after her lifetime, but some of it was published in contemporary journals. Here's the beginnings of A Dozen Cocktails, Please, the very first lines. And here she's, again, sort of dressed in one of her, her clothes were essentially assemblages, before people talked about assemblage. And here, her sort of fanciful description of this, it's so beautiful and so evocative, it takes a minute before you even realize that she's talking about a prophylactic. Which, again, for a woman to be talking about in any way, shape, or form, in any kind of public forum, would have been considered absolutely, positively not appropriate. And she's, when you look through, the 20th century, the various great, feminist artists from Linda Bankless, I don't know about calling Lady Gaga a great artist, but she's certainly an artist of our time. These artists all look back to the Baroness in terms of how does one subvert convention, how does one subvert the establishment, how does one subvert expectations? It's usually through kind of gender play and through appearance, because that's a big part of the feminist movement is subverting expectations about appearance. Dada, of course, is a reverend. I guess that kind of goes without saying at this point. But a very important thing when thinking about Dada is, and when thinking about something that's going to be inspired by Dada is, what is it that is unconventional, or what is it that subverts norms or subverts expectations in one's own time? In this particular case, nailing a stuffed monkey to a piece of wood and saying it's a portrait of Rembrandt, portrait of Cézanne, portrait of Renoir. Picking these figures who are unquestionably members of the canon, people who are the accepted and who are the collectible and who are the people you're supposed to study and you're supposed to know as an artist or an art historian. Mocking it, satirizing it, parodying these accepted and vaunted figures. This is the irreverence that the Dadaists are associated with. In here we got a lot going on here, because you've not only got probably a satire of the most famous, the most accepted, the most valued work of art in Western history, but then also language play, which the Dadaists were also involved in. So not only has he defiled the most revered female figure in art history, but then he writes down below her this acronym, LHOOQ, which if you sound it out sounds like look, which is what we're doing, but if you sound it out, it makes a French phrase, elle a chaud au cou, which basically translates to she's hot down below, or she has a hot ass, but not a hot ass like she's hot. Yeah, that's what it essentially is saying. So he's finding as many different ways as he can to, again, chop down these vaunted and figures that we associate with this established idea of what is good or what is important, and making us rethink this. Dada is very immature. There's no question about it. You haven't gotten that idea yet from what I've said. Dada is very immature. But that is a big part of it, the acceptance of vulgarity, the acceptance of taking these little bits out of our everyday culture, and by elevating them for even just a brief moment, like this matchbook on the cover of Wrong Wrong, which was the journal that followed The Blind Man that Duchamp put together, which only had one issue. Journals to the Dadaists were, for us, like websites. When they needed to say something, they'd do a journal about what they need to say, and then they just end the journal because they said what they needed to say. It didn't need to keep going on. So Wrong Wrong only had one issue. And taking this matchbook and just for a second sort of elevating, yes, it's a crude, joke that, might incite, you know, a belly laugh or something like that, but what is it really saying? Is it really saying anything? Well, why is our culture so full of this if there's no real need for it, if there's no meaning for it? There must be something to it. They're not trying to elevate it to an intellectual discussion, but elevate it to the point where we are, for a moment, aware that there isn't just the Mona Lisa, that there's other kinds of culture that we need to take into account. And people were aware of this at the time. The cheerless art of idiocy is what this newspaper calls Dada. There is, as a part of Dada, a very strong part of the program is acting foolish, is acting immature, is acting vulgar in order to subvert those expectations of what one is supposed to act like or what one's supposed to be like. Dada is irritating to a lot of people. A lot of people don't like it. That is part of it. Dada is not something, as you can see from what these artists do, they're clearly not seeking your approval. They're not seeking your enjoyment. They're not necessarily seeking your acceptance. They're making it regardless of whether you accept it or not. And when I think of irritating, I certainly think of Man Ray's Object to be Destroyed, which he took a metronome and he cut out a picture of an eye, and he put it on the metronome, and when you started swinging, the eye tick-tocks back and forth in the most disconcerting fashion. If you ever have an opportunity to see it in operation, I recommend it, because I guarantee you it lasts 30 seconds before you have to get away from it. And in fact, after Lee Miller, who's a photographer, she broke up with Man Ray, she left him, and he replaced the picture of the eye on the one that he had with a picture of her eye, and then he wrote this as the instruction, this sort of new way of understanding Object to be Destroyed, which is now what you do is you watch it until you just can't take it anymore, then you smash it completely with a hammer and destroy it. And in 1957, actually a group of students took him up on the instructions and the title. They stole the original Object to be Destroyed. Man Ray tried to get it back. They put it down on the floor, and a guy shot it with a gun and destroyed it. And Man Ray has made many, many since. And since it's the indestructible object, because all you need is a metronome and a picture of Lee Miller's eye, and you can make as many of these objects to be destroyed as you want. So it's the concept where the art is not in the object, even as it's existing in a wide variety of different permutations all over the world now. So in terms of the Dada Ball, and in terms of how all of this sort of fits into this idea of celebration and party, the balls, there was no Dada Ball yet, because these artists weren't even using the term Dada at the time, but there were balls like the Rogues Ball, the Blind Man's Ball, and the Ball at the Independence, all of which typically were intended to chronologically line up with some kind of event. So the Independence Ball happened when the Independence opened, and the Blind Man's Ball happened when the first issue of The Blind Man was released. And they were typically costume balls, is what they were. People would dress up in different kinds of outfits. Jean Cratie had a fried egg costume. Mina Loy had a really famous costume. She dressed up as a radiator. Machine stuff was very popular, as you can imagine. The very first one, the theme of it was you dressed up as artwork. You dressed up as in the style of art from post-impressionism to cubism. So any artist in that way, you could dress up, you know, like Seurat, or not like Seurat himself, but like a Seurat, or you dress up like a Picasso or something like that. So these were very carnivalesque in the sense that the carnivalesque, this idea, Mikhail Bakhtin, this idea, looking back to the Feast of Fools from the medieval times, when everything would be turned upside down, and the lower people in the church would do the religious ceremonies, and the upper people would be the lower people, and everything would be reversed. Basically, it was before Lent. Everybody would just go nuts and have a blast before Lent, because you're about to go into this, 40 days, is it? 40 days of, kind of self-deprecation. So this was kind of the same thing. There was very much a sense of the carnivalesque, very much a sense of kind of the reversal. High and low are reversed, which is what I've been talking about pretty much the whole time with Dada. So in terms of the Dada Ball, if you're thinking about ideas, I hope that looking at some of this artwork and talking about some of these things has given rise to ideas or inspirations or whatever. So thank you so much for listening to me.